How can there be 12 tribes if half of them simply vanish from history? How is it possible that a people marked by alliances, genealogies, and eternal promises disappeared without leaving any apparent trace? This is the forbidden question, the open wound in the biblical narrative, the shadow that hangs over centuries of silence, the forgotten descendants. Where is the blood of the tribes? This is the mystery that nobody wants to face head-on, but today it will be dragged out of hiding. Imagine the power of that. An entire people bearing the identity of God simply dissolved among nations, cultures, and languages. They were taken away, scattered, hidden. What remained were fragments, rumors, echoes of a lineage that should have traversed the centuries like a fiery arrow, but which seems to have turned to dust in the wind. Except it didn't. What God has marked never disappears. Nothing that carries a promise is lost in the abyss of time. And it is here that the story begins to become disturbing, fascinating, and absolutely necessary. Because this isn't just a video about archaeology, history, or theology. It's about blood. Ancient blood. Prophetic blood. Blood that carries destiny. Blood that still pulses in ordinary people, ordinary families, entire cultures that may not even imagine that within them echoes the distant sound of the patriarchs. The blood of the tribes, the forgotten blood. The blood sought for centuries, silenced by wars, exiles, empires, and traditions that shattered like ancient vases. What if that blood never disappeared? What if it just spread, mixed, camouflaged itself exactly as the prophet said it would? What if the mystery isn't the disappearance, but the revelation that hasn't yet happened? That changes everything. That turns the tables on history. That makes anyone rethink their certainties. Because where there is blood, there is memory. Where there is memory, there is identity. And where there is identity, there is destiny. Consider the impact of this idea. Entire peoples carrying ancestral marks without realizing it. Mysterious traditions that don't fit together. Rituals that arise out of nowhere. Surnames that span continents. Isolated communities that preserve customs reminiscent of ancient Israel, even without ever having had direct contact with it. Is it coincidence, or is it heritage? Is it chance, or is it blood? This is the moment when history ceases to be a dusty book and becomes a mirror that may reveal more than we want to see. Because if the tribes haven't disappeared, then someone today carries a part of them, and that possibility is too great, too dangerous, too transformative to be ignored. The silence of centuries begins to break here, not with ready-made answers, but with sharp, uncomfortable, inevitable questions. Because before entering the chaos of disappearance, we need to confront the weight of the initial question, the forbidden question, the question that dismantles any simplistic explanation. How did an entire people vanish without ever ceasing to exist? And if you're here, it's no coincidence. Something in this mystery calls to you, nudges you, provokes you. Something inside you knows that this story isn't over, that there's an invisible line connecting past, present, and future. A line of blood, a line of destiny, and that's exactly the line we're going to pull on now, forcefully. No rush, uncensored, without fear. Get ready for what's coming next. Because once we start untying this knot, there's no going back. Before we delve into the deeper parts of this mystery, and believe me, what comes next is explosive, I need you to do something essential to keep this investigation alive. If this topic has intrigued you, if this forbidden question has ignited something within you, then comment below what you think about the disappearance of these tribes. Your comment isn't just an opinion. It shows that this type of content needs to continue to exist, needs to be shared with more people who are also seeking answers. And one more thing, leave a like now. Don't wait until later. That's what makes the algorithm understand that this issue matters, that this story can't stay buried. This strengthens the video's reach, paves the way for new episodes, and allows the investigation to go even deeper. And if you're not already subscribed, subscribe now and turn on notifications. That way, you'll ensure you don't miss any details of this journey, because what we're about to reveal is unique. It's not found anywhere else, and many people prefer that this kind of knowledge remain private. Do this before we continue. Comment, like, subscribe. This isn't just support, it's part of the discovery, because the more people understand this mystery, the clearer it becomes. Now we can move on. The day Israel split was not merely a political event, not just a rift between proud kings or a power struggle. It was the beginning of a spiritual wound that never healed. It was the moment when the blood of the tribes began to disperse, not completely, but like cracks silently spreading across an ancient vessel. The rupture between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom did not happen overnight. It was built brick by brick, pride by pride, decision by decision, until the chosen nation fragmented into two halves that would never again fit together perfectly. And it is here that the disappearance begins to take shape, not with armies, but with spiritual choices. Imagine this scene. 12 tribes, united by a unique identity, now separated by invisible borders, by internal tensions, by resentments that have grown like weeds in the heart of each people. The southern kingdom, Judah and Benjamin, maintained the temple, maintained its central identity. The northern kingdom, with its 10 tribes, distanced itself, built alternative altars, adopted practices that deviated from the original essence. The fragmentation was not only territorial, it was genetic, it was spiritual, it was emotional, it was cultural. When a nation divides, its descendants also divide. And when this division lasts for generations, bloodlines begin to spread in unpredictable directions. This is the point that almost no one realizes. The disappearance of the tribes did not begin with the captivity. It began much earlier, when Israel stopped looking at the same altar, when it stopped hearing the same voice, when it stopped walking under the same cloud of presence. Unity is what preserves identity. Division is what dissolves it, and that is why this moment is so crucial to understanding where the blood of the tribes is today, because the initial rupture opened the way for these lineages to be pushed out of visible history centuries later. The 10 northern tribes began to forge their own paths. Their leaders, their local prophets, their kings, all contributed to the construction of a parallel identity, less protected, less preserved. The cities were exposed, traditions began to mix, and little by little, that unity that once defined Israel became a collection of scattered pieces. Spiritual fragmentation creates ethnic fragmentation. There is no way to separate these two things. When a people loses its central spiritual reference, it begins to absorb external cultural elements, new alliances, new customs, new influences. And this is not just history, it is genetics, it is heritage, it is destiny dispersing. It's possible to imagine families splitting apart, traditions being disputed, priests trying to maintain a thread of identity while the people sought answers elsewhere. It's possible to imagine children growing up without a sense of tribal unity, seeing Judah as an adversary, seeing Jerusalem as something distant, almost irrelevant. The blood was still the same, but the paths were no longer the same. And what keeps the blood alive? Memory. And when memory is divided, the blood disperses along with it. This part of the story is essential to understanding what happened next, because the disappearance of the tribes was not an isolated event. It was a domino effect. An inevitable effect. When the northern kingdom separated, it exposed itself, and when it exposed itself, it was lost. Not literally, but in a profound, complex, irreversible way in the eyes of traditional history, because identity doesn't disappear all at once. It dilutes, it mixes, it hides, it transforms into something so dispersed that centuries later no one can point and say, "Here is the tribe." But blood always leaves traces, always. And that's what makes this search so fascinating. Because to understand where the forgotten descendants are today, we need to look at the moment when these roots began to separate, to extend in different directions, like branches of a tree that grow in opposite directions without ever losing their connection to the same ancient root. Every step we take from here on out depends on understanding this initial fragmentation. Because it was there, at that exact moment, that the fate of the tribes changed forever. What would come later, invasions, exiles, dispersal among nations, was only possible because first there was an internal division. The silence of the tribes begins here. Before we move on to the next stage of this investigation, I want you to leave your comment on this crucial point in the story. Write, "I want to understand the root," or share your opinion on how this division may have affected the fate of the tribes. This helps keep the conversation alive and boosts the video for more people who are also seeking answers. The Assyrian captivity was the blow that transformed a wound into an abyss. If the division between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom opened the crack, it was the Assyrian invasion that pushed the 10 tribes into it. And here begins the part of the story that most disturbs scholars, archaeologists, theologians, genealogists, and anyone who tries to trace the blood of the tribes. The breaking of the lineage. Not a symbolic break, but a brutal, violent, surgical rupture. An uprooting of entire peoples, dissolved as if they were dust before a gigantic and ruthless empire. When the Assyrians advanced, they not only conquered lands, they erased identities. They tore entire families from their territories, scattered entire communities in unknown regions, forced miscegenation, displacement, exile, and cultural assimilation to the extreme. The Assyrian invasion was like an earthquake that swallowed everything in its path, and within that earthquake were the 10 tribes of the north. What's most striking is imagining what this meant in practice. Entire villages disappearing overnight. Priests captured, leaders torn from their posts, traditions violently broken, customs forbidden, names replaced, children growing up far from the sound of the ancient language, far from the festivals, far from the rituals that preserved Israel's identity. When a people loses its land, it loses its reference point. When it loses its reference point, it loses its memory. And when it loses its memory, it loses its name. That's exactly what happened to the tribes. They didn't disappear because they ceased to exist. They disappeared because they ceased to be recognizable. It's as if the empire had extended a large hand and scattered a handful of sand to the wind. Each grain fell in a different place, mixed with other peoples, other cultures, other blood. And it is precisely at this point that historians get stuck, because there is no clear trail, there is no organized return, there is no linear record. The tribes were not destroyed, they were crushed, scattered, disconnected from each other, mixed in such a way that in the eyes of the empires and scribes, they ceased to be one people and became merely other peoples. And it is this confusion that makes the mystery so powerful. Imagine families being taken to foreign lands, forced to adapt, forced to adopt new customs, new names, new gods. But the blood doesn't change. The lineage doesn't fade. The DNA of the promise doesn't disappear because an empire decided to erase it from the map. It simply hides. It camouflages itself. It waits. It survives silently. And perhaps that's why, even today, people from completely unexpected regions share customs reminiscent of ancient tribes. Small habits, small traditions, small repetitions that are like fragments of a past that never died. What's most intriguing is that the collective disappearance of the tribes doesn't resemble any other historical disappearance. Peoples dominated by the Assyrians usually leave at least some visible trace, some indication of return, some clear mark of descent. But the northern tribes do not. They evaporate. They vanish in such an absolute way that it seems almost intentional, as if someone had erased the trail, as if this part of history had been swallowed by a hole in time. This is the great frustration of historians. They find fragments, but they don't find the complete thread. There are pieces, but the puzzle doesn't seem to fit together. But this also raises another question. Was it really erased, or was it scattered on purpose? What if what seems like disappearance is actually strategic dispersal? What if the ancient prophecy itself already pointed to these tribes becoming a multitude among the nations? What if what seems like a lineage break is a silent expansion, something so big, so deep, so unexpected that it doesn't fit within traditional explanations? Because when a people is scattered to all corners of the world, it becomes part of everything. It ceases to be localized and becomes global, invisible to human eyes, but alive within millions of descendants who don't even imagine where their roots came from. The breaking of the lineage, then, may not have been the end. It may have been the beginning of a worldwide sowing, a spread that transformed 10 tribes into thousands of cultural, ethnic, and spiritual branches. And this explains why so many communities, so different from each other, carry similar traits: meals with traditional elements, customs of ritual purity, ancient practices that don't make sense in the context in which they arose, but which carry the echo of something greater. It's as if the blood had its own memories, memories that span centuries and continue to pulse silently. And when we observe all this, it becomes clear that the disappearance was not absence, it was disguised multiplication. Even so, we cannot ignore the devastating impact of the Assyrian invasion. For the tribes at that time, it was the end of everything they knew. It was the breaking of their home, their language, their culture, their identity. It was the dissolution of what kept them recognizable as a people. The rupture was so profound that official history simply could not keep up with its traces, and it is precisely this lack of traces that leaves so many people uneasy, because where there is no record, there is mystery. Where there is no answer, there is curiosity. Where there is no explanation, there is a search. And it is this search that keeps us here looking back, trying to reconstruct the path of the dust carried by the wind. Trying to understand how an entire people could have been taken, mixed and absorbed, yet still remain alive within the flesh, within the blood, within the silent legacy that transcends generations. For many, this seems impossible. But for those who understand the spiritual depth of history, this is exactly what makes sense, because promises do not die, lineages do not fade, and destinies do not disappear. The shock of the mixing didn't happen all at once. It began silently, almost imperceptibly, like a crack in the rock before a collapse, when those descendants torn from the north were pushed into foreign territories, when they were diluted into cultures, languages, rituals, and peoples that had nothing to do with their lineage. Something much deeper began to die, their tribal identity itself. And here comes the part that nobody likes to face, because we're not talking about simple miscegenation. We're talking about a breakdown of consciousness, a loss of collective memory, a meticulous erasure of what it meant to carry the blood of the tribes. Imagine the children of the tribes walking along unfamiliar roads, hearing names they had never heard, being forced to speak a language that was not their own, and slowly forgetting the taste of their own past. This is not just exile. This is dissolution. It is when a people ceases to recognize itself in the mirror and begins to see the face of another. And yet, something within them persisted, a spark, a residue of identity, a distant echo of the ancient promise. But this echo grew weak, because each new generation grew further from its roots, more immersed in foreign customs, more shaped by the world around it than by the invisible heritage it carried in its blood. And here comes the most disturbing point. There is no exact record, no preserved chronicle, no clear document indicating the precise moment when tribal identity dissolved. History simply loses track. The tribes cease to be tribes and become mixed peoples. The blood continues to flow, but without a name, without a flag, without borders, without belonging. What was once lineage turns to dust, scattered by the winds of kingdoms that no longer exist. And that dust remains alive to this day. Because whether you believe it or not, there is no absolute disappearance when we talk about the human lineage. There is dispersion, there is dissolution, there is historical camouflage. The question that explodes in the midst of this revelation is direct. If the tribes mixed, if they lost their names, their markings, their genealogies, then where is that blood now? Where does it hide? In whom does it pulsate? In whom does it still awaken memories that the mind doesn't understand, but the spirit recognizes? Each foreign family that absorbed a descendant, every remote village that welcomed an exile, each union that mixed the blood of opposing kingdoms, each generation that was born carrying two worlds within itself, all of this created something that no one noticed at the time, a scattered, silent human mosaic, undetectable to the common eye. And when identity is lost, the blood doesn't cease to exist. It simply learns to survive in another way. It begins to live in the shadows, in cultures that will never know they carry a piece of Israel within them. That's why so many researchers, spiritualists, and even independent historians speak of echoes of the promise in peoples who officially have no connection to ancient Israel. But when you look deeper, when you observe patterns, inherited customs without explanation, traditions that survived in unlikely lands, you begin to realize that perhaps, just perhaps, the dust of the tribes never died. It simply mingled with the world. And there's something here that's unsettling, and it should be, because the mixing of nations not only erased identity, but also made it impossible to pinpoint who belongs to what. It made it impossible to determine who carries the heritage and who doesn't. It made it impossible to trace a clear genealogy. And perhaps that's the point. Perhaps the prophecy didn't need pure tribes, but scattered tribes, hidden tribes. Tribes mixed into the human mass, camouflaged until the exact moment of revelation. And this opens up a heavy reflection. How many people today walk the earth carrying blood they don't even imagine? How many nations hold fragments of this lost lineage without ever having heard of themselves? How many descendants are alive now, breathing, living life normally, while carrying within themselves a history that has been erased from maps, but never erased from their DNA? And before we continue, I want to leave you, the viewer, with a thought-provoking question. Was this mixing a historical mistake or part of a greater purpose? Was the disappearance of the tribes a tragedy or a strategic move within something much larger? If you want me to delve deeper into this reasoning, comment below with the phrase, "The dust still lives," because I want to see who's really following this investigation. And if you're feeling that strange shiver while listening to this, also comment, "I want to know the truth," because the next parts will go even deeper into this revelation. When the dust of the tribes began to mingle with the world, many thought they were witnessing just another common tragedy in history, the collapse of a people, the end of an identity, the silent extinction of an entire lineage. But there is a hidden layer here that almost no one dares to touch. The idea that none of this was simply a consequence of wars, exiles, or political choices. There is a thin, almost invisible line that connects all of this to something much greater, to an intention that transcends human logic and tears the veil of common understanding. Because even before the mixing happened, before the tribes disappeared from the maps, before any king or empire raised a sword against them, a phrase had already been uttered that changes the meaning of everything. I will scatter them among the nations. This phrase doesn't sound like punishment. It sounds like a plan. It doesn't sound like punishment. It sounds like strategy, and when you start looking at the disappearance of the tribes through that lens, everything changes color. Imagine a people meant to carry a promise. Imagine a lineage that instead of being concentrated in a single territory, a single people, a single border, would be scattered like invisible seeds across the earth. The tragedy that human eyes witnessed, the breaking, the exile, the dilution, may have been precisely the invisible method for spreading this heritage throughout the world. No longer confined, no longer identifiable, no longer limited, but distributed, hidden, planted. And this completely changes the central question. It's no longer, why did they disappear? Now it becomes, why did they need to be scattered? Because if there is a purpose in it, then disappearance is not an end. It's strategic dispersal. It's not ruin. It's silent expansion. It's not erasure. It's spiritual camouflage. And here's a detail that many people ignore. If the spreading was intentional, it means that the entire world, on some level, carries fragments of that promise. It means that distant peoples, different cultures, languages that have never met, may be connected by the same ancient root, even without being aware of it. It means that the blood that once flowed within tribes now flows through the planet like underground rivers, invisible but present. This concept is so powerful, so provocative, that many people avoid thinking about it, because it confronts the idea that identity depends on purity or isolation. On the contrary, it affirms that identity can survive precisely when it is broken and scattered. It's as if that lineage were a light, and instead of leaving it concentrated in a single beam, the plan was to transform it into thousands of lost glimmers among the nations, ready to be rekindled at the right time. And then another question arises that leaves anyone uneasy. If the scattering was part of the plan, then when does that plan end? Because no strategy exists without an ultimate goal. No spreading happens without a curfew, and it is in this tension between concealment and revelation that the mystery of the tribes gains a new depth. Perhaps the disappearance was not only necessary, perhaps it was prophetic. Perhaps the mixing, the exile, and the loss of identity were the path to preparing something that would only make sense centuries later. And this directly touches the present. Because if the tribes were scattered, if the blood is hidden within millions of people, if the promise was silently distributed, then there is a possibility that you, unknowingly, carry in your own blood a fragment of this ancient history. And I'm not talking about genetics as a laboratory science. I'm talking about spiritual memory, about heritage that goes beyond what the eye can see. How many people feel an inexplicable connection to biblical, prophetic themes, to the ancient history of Israel, even without having been taught about it? How many feel an inner pull, as if something within them awakens when they hear these narratives? What if this awakening wasn't a coincidence, but an echo? What if this echo were precisely the clue that the plan of dispersal still pulsates through the generations? What if that, I will scatter them among the nations, is still being fulfilled right now as you watch this video? The most provocative thing here is realizing that dispersal didn't destroy the tribes. It only multiplied them in a way that no empire could control. Where there were once 12 identifiable lineages, there are now thousands of branches lost in the world, mixed, hidden, dormant. And you begin to understand that the disappearance may have actually been the greatest spiritual expansion ever recorded. And that's why I want you to reflect deeply on this. If the promise hasn't died, if it has only spread, then someone, somewhere, will be the point of reconnection. Someone will be the first to feel the call, the first to realize that the disappearance is not the end of the story, but the beginning of something much greater. When the dispersal seemed complete, and the tribes reduced to dust scattered by the winds of nations, something began to happen in the shadows of history, something that made no noise, did not attract the attention of empires, did not record dates in official documents, but continued to live, pulsing like an underground vein. Because even when everything indicates breakage, loss, fragmentation, there is always something that resists in silence. And that is where the silent lineages come in. Families, groups, and peoples who, without realizing it, have carried for centuries the deep traces of an ancient heritage, not a heritage shown, announced, or celebrated, but a heritage that survives in the body, in behavior, in customs, in spiritual instincts, in memories that no one can explain with common logic. It's striking to think that, while maps shifted, kingdoms fell, and cultures blended, certain genes, certain codes, certain spiritual signs simply refused to disappear. They hid among dialects, diluted themselves in local customs, camouflaged themselves in surnames that no one associates with Israel, but they remained, a persistent echo that insists on surviving even when an entire lineage is declared extinct. And when you begin to look at this phenomenon, this blood that still flows, even when history tries to erase it, you realize that the disappearance of the tribes was not absolute. It was merely the exchange of a public silence for a hidden presence. And what's most fascinating is that many of these lineages never knew they carried something special. They grew up thinking they were just part of an ordinary people, a common culture, a common history. But some traditions that should have been erased during the invasions remained alive in an almost stubborn way. Unexplained family customs, ancient words that someone repeats without knowing their origin, habits that cross generations for no apparent reason. They are small signs, almost imperceptible, but they behave like traces of a spiritual memory much older than anyone who lives it today. These silent lineages spread across Asia, Africa, Europe, the Arabian Peninsula, and also the Americas, carrying crumbs of an identity that never died. And we are not talking about entire peoples, about large, officially recognized groups. We are talking about specific families, specific names, specific stories that carry in their blood something they themselves cannot name. Because, when the prophecy says that they would be scattered among the nations, this does not only mean geography, it means a deep, invisible mixture, incorporated into DNA and also into spirituality. And that's why so many people today feel a mysterious calling when they hear about lost tribes. It's a reaction that can't be explained logically. It's an unease, a restless curiosity, a magnetism. People who have never studied the subject in depth, but who, upon hearing about lineage, promise, dispersal, and restoration, feel as if someone is speaking directly to them. This doesn't happen by chance. There are things the mind doesn't recognize, but the spirit remembers. It's as if, even after centuries of oppression, exile, and mixing, this blood still carries a kind of inner mark that cannot be erased. And because of this, there are people living today, walking among us, who may be direct descendants of tribes that have officially disappeared from history. People who never heard their grandparents talk about it, who never saw documents, who never thought about ancient lineage, but who somehow carry this silent heritage in their bodies and souls. And the most impressive thing is that deep down, they themselves realize they have something different, even without knowing how to explain what it is. And when you combine that with what we discussed before, the plan, the prophecy, the strategic dispersal, it begins to make sense that these silent lineages are like small flames, hidden in dark caves, waiting for the right moment to be lit again. because if the promise continued, the sign also continued. And if the sign continued, it means there is a purpose in the fact that these lineages still exist, even after everything they tried to do to extinguish them. Imagine, for example, families that maintained traditions foreign to the customs of the region. Families that always celebrated the new moon without knowing why. Families that avoided certain foods without understanding the original spiritual reason. Families that recited ancient different prayers passed down without explanation. This is not coincidence. This is silent resistance. This is the echo of the promise. And when you hear stories of peoples who were completely absorbed by others, but who continue to exhibit customs that should have disappeared centuries ago, you realize that blood not only survives, it speaks, it records, it endures. And when the spirit encounters this blood, it awakens memories that the human mind would not know how to access on its own. Perhaps you yourself have felt this. Perhaps you've experienced that shiver when you hear certain ancient passages, that strange sense of familiarity when you see old maps of Israel, that deep, almost visceral interest in prophetic, tribal, spiritual themes. It's as if something inside you stirs, as if you recognize a story you never consciously learned. This happens to more people than you imagine, and that's why this topic attracts so many people with such force. Because deep down, there's a real possibility that the blood of the tribes not only survived, but is much more widespread today than it was when it all began. The world is full of silent lineages waiting for their moment to awaken. Ordinary people with an extraordinary heritage. When we talk about silent lineages, many people imagine isolated groups, small clans hidden in remote regions. But the truth is even more intriguing. There are signs, clues, symbols, and customs scattered across the entire planet that suggest something bold. The possibility that each continent carries fragments, echoes, and deep traces of ancient tribes. And this isn't about assuming modern identities or making political claims. It's about realizing that the dispersal of the tribes was not just a historical tragedy, but a silent global expansion that left traces in places where no one would expect to find Hebrew heritage. And the more closely you look, the more you realize that these traits are not coincidences. They appear in rituals, family structures, symbols engraved in art, religious customs that don't fit with local traditions, and even in spiritual practices that seem out of the ordinary for the people who carry them out. When you put it all together, it begins to form a fascinating mosaic, as if an invisible thread connected cultures separated by oceans, deserts, and centuries. Starting with Africa, a continent where ancestral memories breathe strongly. There are African communities with traditions that echo ancient practices, forms of celebration and ritual separation reminiscent of ancient Hebrew patterns, languages that carry similar words, family customs that reinforce the idea of lineage, purity, law, spiritual transmission. And we are not talking about modern influences. These are habits so ancient that the practitioners themselves say they have always existed, as if they had arisen from nothing. And it is precisely this, from nothing, that draws attention. Because when a custom has no local explanation, its origin is usually much further away. In Asia, the feeling is similar. Mountainous peoples, migratory groups, and isolated clans preserve stories about ancestors who crossed deserts, fled wars, carried sacred codes, and spoke of a single god while surrounding cultures worshipped many. There are societies that maintain symbols engraved on fabrics and ritual objects that seem taken directly from ancient Hebrew traditions, not in the obvious details, but in the patterns invisible to those unfamiliar with the codes. And this raises the question that lingers like a whisper. What if an entire tribe had followed an unexpected path and mixed with Asian peoples, leaving a mark that the modern world never noticed? When you leap to Europe, things get even quieter. But perhaps for that very reason, even more intriguing. Amidst the avalanche of Greco-Roman, Celtic, Germanic and Nordic culture, some family rituals survive like hidden spiritual fossils. Traditions that speak of escape, of dispersal, of ancient peoples who arrived from afar with customs that did not belong to the local tribes. Family lines marked by discipline, by a strong sense of identity, by spiritual practices that seemed out of place in the European context. It's as if, amidst kingdoms and empires, small pockets of memory have survived camouflaged, waiting to be recognized. But perhaps the most shocking scenario lies in the Americas. Here the distance is so great, the ocean so vast, that many dismiss any possibility. But human history would never obey the limits created by modern maps. Amidst the great pre-Columbian civilizations and native peoples, there are descriptions, symbols and traditions whose origin is unclear. Where did certain standards of purity come from? Why did some tribes have practices so similar to ancient laws? And why did some peoples preserve a pure monotheism amidst entirely polytheistic civilizations? These are questions that echo like half-open doors, and those who look inside realize that the answers may be older than anyone imagines. These connections scattered around the world are not definitive proof, but they are clues. Clues that form a global web, a network of cultural fragments that seem to shout a hidden truth. The disappearance of the tribes was not the end, it was the scattering. And when something as profound as identity, lineage and spirituality is scattered, the result is an invisible map that covers the entire planet with ancient signs, transmitted from generation to generation without anyone noticing. And you know what's most curious? The more people study these clues, the more they discover that they connect with each other. Traditions from Africa resemble customs from Asia. European symbols seem to echo stories from the Americas. A word that survives in a mountain dialect resembles an expression used in the Middle East thousands of years ago. It's as if a thread has been cut, but the pieces are still out there, just waiting to be put back together. And this generates a powerful, almost spiritual feeling that there is much more behind this story than we have been taught. After all, when completely different cultures share similar traits, the most logical explanation often lies not in the land where they were born, but in the roots they shared before losing each other. That's why so many people today feel they can have a real connection to ancient tribes without ever having heard of it in their family. The heritage may be in the blood, but it can also be in spiritual memory, in intuition, in that feeling of, "This makes sense to me. They will return." This phrase echoes like an ancient beat, a sound that vibrates deep within the soul, as if coming from a place where time has no dominion. The voice of the prophets never disappeared. It merely hid in the cracks of history, waiting for the moment to reignite. And now, when the world seems more fragmented, more confused, more thirsty for answers, that voice begins to tremble again, not like a whisper, but like the prelude to something gigantic. Because the final restoration is not an isolated event, not a disconnected prophetic scene. It is the return of peoples who don't even know who they are, but who carry in their bones the lost memory of ancient alliances, of paths that were cut, of promises that hung in the air like an unfinished oath. Imagine this with me. People on every continent, completely different cultures, distant traditions, and yet a silent calling begins to pulsate within them. Something that no one can explain, because it doesn't come from reason, but from a spiritual root that never dies. Prophecy has always made it clear that there would be a return, but not an obvious, geographical, simple return. No, the return would be an awakening. A moment when a multitude scattered across the nations, confused, mixed, seemingly disconnected, suddenly feels something touching them from within. as if a curtain were torn, and they realized that their personal stories were only fragments of a much older story. It's dramatic, it's disconcerting, it's cosmic. And this part you need to understand strongly. It's not about blood, ethnicity, documents, or neat genealogical lines. It's about spiritual identity, about lost purpose, about a people who carry their origin in inner signs, in intuition, in recurring dreams that no one can interpret. The final restoration will not be led only by those who know. It will be driven by those who feel. Think about it. How many people today have the strange feeling that they belong to something bigger? How many have that almost unsettling impression that they were born out of place in time, as if they came from a place they don't remember? This is not delusion. This is spiritual resonance. And this resonance is exactly what the prophets pointed to when they spoke of a people who would return without even knowing that they had ever left. This return doesn't begin with caravans walking through deserts. It begins within. It begins when the Spirit awakens something that has been dormant for generations. And this is where the mystery becomes even denser. Because we're not just talking about a spiritual process. We're talking about a prophetic movement with real consequences in the physical world. When this awakening begins, it changes behaviors, generations, perceptions, choices. People who have never been interested in spiritual topics begin to seek answers. Others who have always been skeptical begin to wonder why they are feeling a kind of calling. It's as if an invisible force is realigning the pieces, pulling each person to the place where they should be, not physically but spiritually. And the prophecy of the final restoration has always made it clear that this movement would be silent at first. No dramatic signs for everyone to see, no grand spectacles. The beginning would be internal, profound, almost intimate. And that's exactly how it's happening. While the world chases after chaos, conflict, politics, wars, and endless distractions, a regrouping is happening from within, a reconnection of souls that seemed lost, a vibration that unites without the world noticing. But we notice, you notice. Just by being here, you feel that this speaks to some part of you that you don't usually access. And that's what makes this narrative so powerful. It touches on something universal. Something that transcends countries, cultures, limits, borders. The final restoration isn't about a people returning to a place. It's about a people returning to themselves. About men and women discovering that their intuitions, their signs, their repeated experiences, their dreams, all of this is not coincidence. It's a calling. It's prophecy being fulfilled in the everyday, in the invisible, in that which no one sees, but everyone feels when they awaken. And the most impactful part is yet to come, because when this awakening reaches critical mass, when enough people feel this inner calling, when this lost identity begins to reveal itself as a whole, no longer as isolated individuals, then the movement begins to become visible. Then the world realizes that there is a rising force that did not come from institutions, did not come from human leaders, did not come from ideologies. It came from the ancient promise itself, sealed even before nations existed. And do you know what that means? It means we're still at the beginning. The tide has only just begun to turn. The pieces are still moving. The return of those who don't know who they are is only beginning to take shape. And if you feel something pulling you, if this story provokes in you a restlessness, a curiosity, a strange vibration, perhaps it says much more about you than you imagine. Perhaps you are part of this awakening. Perhaps you are hearing the same voice that echoed in the deserts, in the mountains, in exile, in the valleys. The same voice that now tries to be heard in the midst of this noisy world. And before we continue this journey, because it's going to delve deeper, tell me in the comments, have you ever felt this sense of calling? Comment, I feel the calling, if this resonated with you. Or, if you prefer, comment, I want to understand my purpose. These words help spread this message to more people who may also be feeling the same thing and have no idea what it means. Modern research rekindles what has remained buried in the dust of history for centuries. And the most ironic, almost poetic thing is that the scientific world, so accustomed to discrediting anything that smacks of prophecy, ended up stumbling upon clues that shouldn't exist. It's as if reality itself is tired of being hidden. As if the invisible layers of the past have decided to emerge, causing profound discomfort in the academic world. Because when science, DNA, and spirituality begin to intersect, no one can simply turn away and pretend nothing is happening. And you know something big is moving when even the most skeptical feel that unsettling pang, that sensation that the puzzle is beginning to reveal its true image. The truth is that modern science is touching on territories that once belonged only to prophets. Genetic research reveals strange patterns, dispersed lineages, improbable connections between peoples who should never share the same roots. Anthropological studies uncover symbols, traditions, and practices that don't fit into any conventional historical narrative. Archaeological discoveries appear in unexpected places, as if someone had deliberately placed pieces to force the world to see. And when these pieces come together, they form a trail that points to something many have tried to bury: the real existence of ancient peoples scattered among nations, surviving like sparks from a bonfire that never went out. And the most impressive thing is that none of this is happening in isolation. They are small discoveries that accumulate. A study here, another there, a DNA analysis that reveals an improbable genetic signature, a cultural practice that seems out of place, a spiritual custom that is repeated in distant regions. It's as if there were an invisible code traversing centuries, a spiritual DNA that insists on surviving, even mixed, even diluted, even dormant. And this code is beginning to awaken, not because someone decided to look for it, but because it is forcing the door open to be found. That's exactly what bothers the academic world so much. Because when the evidence begins to align with what has long been seen as myth, legend, spiritual fantasy, the castle of certainty begins to crack. Science likes to control the narrative. It likes to explain everything with formulas, numbers, cold hypotheses. But what is emerging now doesn't fit into the usual boxes. These are clues that mix history and mystery, calculation and prophecy, chemistry and promise. And when these worlds collide, everything becomes destabilized. Imagine laboratories analyzing samples from communities that have no idea they carry within them fragments of lineages buried millennia ago. Imagine teams of archaeologists finding symbols that don't belong to that continent, but that echo traditions described in sacred texts. Imagine linguists perplexed by words that appear in cultures that should never have crossed paths. None of this is a coincidence. It's a summons. It's an awakening. It's the past demanding to be recognized in the present. And the most fascinating thing about this modern quest is that it's not just rekindling the fuse, it's illuminating paths that were extinguished. Because every scientific discovery, however small, carries a spiritual spark. Science tries to keep everything in the material realm, but it can't avoid the feeling of touching something greater. It's almost as if the ancient promises are answering, showing that regardless of the barriers, the dispersions, the distances, the ancient memory never died. It only became silent. But now, finally, it begins to speak again. And while studies advance, while laboratories compare genetic patterns, while anthropologists are forced to reevaluate entire theories, while archaeologists become uncomfortable with pieces that don't fit, something bigger happens in the subtext. Ordinary people begin to recognize themselves in the gaps, because when a scientific discovery touches a spiritual point, it activates something within the human being. It's as if each new revelation ignites a spark of identity in those who watch from afar, in those who don't even imagine they are part of this story. People begin to feel connected to themes they have never explored. They begin to be curious about origins they never questioned. They begin to search for signs, meanings, traces. Science, unintentionally, is opening the door that prophecy foretold. And this changes everything. Because, contrary to what many expected, this modern quest is not weakening spirituality, it is strengthening it. It is bringing to the table proofs, clues, evidence that challenge old narratives and force new questions. It forces researchers to admit that there is something there, something that escapes the traditional scientific method. Something that vibrates, that persists, that always returns, like an invisible thread that stitches time together. And when these discoveries connect with ancient spiritual traditions, with promises, with visions, with mysteries that have spanned generations, the narrative takes shape. It gains strength. It gains urgency. Because no one can ignore the fact that there is a movement happening beneath the surface of time, a silent restoration that is using science precisely to reveal what history has tried to hide. We're getting to the point that nobody likes to face, but that everyone feels burning deep down. After all this, after captivity, dispersal, silent lineages, cultural clues, prophecies, genetic codes, scattered traditions, the question that cuts like a blade arises. The inevitable question. The question that throbs in the subconscious of anyone who follows this journey with truly open eyes: where is the blood of the tribes today? Not in a symbolic sense, not as a pretty metaphor to close the video, but literally. Where is it? Where does it pulse? Where do you live? Because if there is something that history has not been able to kill, that dispersal has not been able to erase, and that science cannot ignore, it is the fact that this lineage continues, fragmented, mixed, silent, but it continues. And perhaps the answer has never been more urgent than now. Because the deeper we delve into this line of inquiry, the more we realize that the question is not merely historical, nor theological, nor scientific. It is personal. It spans centuries only to fall into the lap of whoever hears this today. It touches the heart of identity, of origin, of spiritual memory. And the most curious thing is that no matter how many theories attempt to rationally explain all this, none can erase the feeling that this blood is closer than we imagine, much closer. Perhaps within reach of our very breath, perhaps in the DNA of someone listening to me now, perhaps behind a curiosity you can't explain. Perhaps hidden in seemingly common customs you grew up seeing without realizing their origin, perhaps in traits, behaviors, spiritual sensitivities that you never connected to anything, but that are now beginning to make sense. That's why the question hurts. Because deep down it's not asking, where are they? It's asking, who are we? About which part of this story has traversed time, crossed oceans, traversed kingdoms, survived wars, escapes, oppressions, falling kingdoms and rising empires, only to continue living in the modern world, living in people who don't even know they're carrying the thread of an ancient prophecy. And when you think about it seriously, without joking, you begin to perceive a strange, almost unsettling pattern. This search for the tribes is not just about reconstructing the past, but about preparing for the future. Because if there is a prophecy saying that they would return, that they would be reunited, that they would awaken, then the question of where that blood is today is not an intellectual exercise. It is a warning, a sign that we are getting closer and closer to the moment when all of this will emerge once and for all. And the boldest, the most provocative, the most unsettling thing is to think about the possibility that this blood was never far away, that it did not disappear, that it spread, yes, but did not dissolve, that it mixed, but did not die. That it is alive, walking the streets, studying, working, living normal routines, thinking it's just another ordinary person, while, in fact, it carries within itself fragments of a promise that does not lose its validity. What if someone is looking right in your direction while you listen to this? What if part of this story is passing through you, without you even realizing it until now? What if this curiosity, this unease, this strange magnetism for spiritual, biblical, prophetic, and historical themes isn't just interest, but memory, spiritual memory, ancestral memory, something that for some reason is awakening right now, not as a coincidence, but as a summons? This is what makes this question the video's main hook, because when we ask ourselves where the blood of the tribes is today, the answer can no longer be limited to old maps, geographical hypotheses, or academic theories. The answer points to something alive, current, pulsating, something that moves silently, that reveals itself in details, in sensations, in inexplicable affinities, something that touches specific people at specific moments, with specific intensity. And this opens a door that no one can close, the possibility that the blood of the tribes is exactly where it is least expected, in the midst of nations, in the heart of modernity, disguised as normality, mixed into everyday life, and above all, much closer to you than anyone would imagine. This is what prepares the ground for the next chapter of this spiritual investigation. Because it's not about where are they, it's about why now. Why is this theme returning with such force? Why are so many people in different countries, different cultures, different ages, beginning to feel drawn to this theme as if something were calling from within? Why does the feeling of spiritual déjà vu increase in those who hear these stories? Is it coincidence? Is it chance? Or are we entering precisely the time when what has been scattered will begin to come together? Perhaps what we are seeing is not the end of a search, but the beginning of a revelation. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Thank you for watching and stay tuned for the next chapters.